She thought it was just a snowdrift, until it whimpered. Beneath the frozen silence was a puppy, barely alive, buried like someone wanted it gone forever. But saving him was only the beginning. As she nursed him back from the edge of death, she uncovered a secret buried deeper than the snow. A secret that would expose a forgotten network of cruelty and force her to confront her own past. The more she searched for answers, the more danger followed. Who buried this dog? And why were they so desperate to keep him hidden? Would you risk everything for a life no one else cared about? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more true inspired stories that will break your heart and heal it too. Let me know if you want this rewritten for voiceover pacing or subtitle style. The town of Snowridge lay under a frozen hush, buried beneath the thick silence of a storm that had passed only hours before. Nestled between the timber-stained slopes of the Windvale Mountains in northern Wyoming, it was the kind of place where time didn't move so much as creak forward, like an old weather vane straining against rust. Snow clung to everything. Telephone poles bowed with the weight, pine trees drooping like solemn sentinels, and the cracked windows of abandoned houses frosting from within. It was here on the outskirts of town, where the wind carved valleys into the drifts and the roads rarely saw salt, that Ellie Monroe walked alone. Ellie was 34, tall and slender with a kind of quiet resilience that came not from peace, but from persistent grief. Her dark brown hair, streaked lightly with silver from stress rather than age, was pulled back in a lazy braid beneath her fur-lined hood. She had sharp features softened by sleepless nights, hollowed cheeks, pale skin, and deep-set hazel eyes that always looked a little distant, like she was staring at something only she could see. Once, she had been a woman who laughed easily and taught art classes in a small school 2 towns over. But that was before her husband, Jason, died in a hunting accident 2 winters ago, before the isolation crept in and insomnia took up permanent residence. Since then, she had taken a job with the state, monitoring the decommissioned signal tower outside town. It wasn't much, just checking systems that didn't really need checking, logging in times for routes that no longer ran. But it gave her structure, and structure, Ellie had learned, was sometimes all that kept her breathing. She trudged along the trail that led to the old rail switch, her boots crunching softly through the powder. The wind had finally died, leaving behind a stillness so complete it felt sacred. The sky above was gray, dense with unfallen snow, but the air had that brittle bite of calm after chaos. Ellie's breath fogged before her in small ghosts, and she exhaled slowly, as if releasing something she didn't want to name. As she neared the switch house, a squat concrete structure with peeling paint and a crooked metal door, something caught her along the edge of the railway. At first, it looked like nothing more than a lumpy rise in the snow, one of many scattered across the shoulder of the embankment. But something about it was wrong. It wasn't shaped like the others. It had a strange depression in the middle, uneven like someone had scooped at it and then hastily covered it back up. Ellie stopped. A strange pulse passed through her chest. Intuition, or maybe just a flicker of hope desperate to feel useful. She stepped carefully off the packed trail, boots sinking deeper into the powder. As she drew closer, she saw it, a patch of frost-darkened fur, tangled and pressed into the snow. Her breath caught. Ellie dropped to her knees, pulling off her glove with one hand and brushing the snow away. Beneath the thin layer of ice and white was a small body, curled, stiff, and frighteningly still. A puppy. Husky. Maybe, though it was hard to tell. Its fur was clumped with frozen mud, ears iced at the tips, paws tucked against its belly as if trying to hold in warmth that no longer existed. Ellie touched its side. Cold. Too cold. But then barely, just barely, a shiver. A twitch of muscle beneath the matted coat. A breath. Shallow. But there. Oh, God, she whispered, and her voice trembled. You're alive. She scooped the puppy into her coat without hesitation, clutching it close to her chest, where her heartbeat might pass for comfort. The creature weighed almost nothing, just bones and chill and silence. Ellie stood, legs unsteady, and turned back toward the switch house. But she didn't go in. Not this time. This wasn't about schedules or rail logs. This was something else. Her cabin was half a mile further up the trail, nestled in a hollow of trees where the snow fell slower. The walk back felt endless. The wind had returned in faint gusts, catching her hood and stinging her eyes, but she kept going, boots thudding through the crust. She didn't speak. She just held the dog tighter. Ellie's cabin was small, weather-worn, and exactly what people imagine when they thought of solitude. A wood stove, a small kitchen, a narrow bed beneath the eaves. She burst through the door, slammed it shut with her shoulder, and knelt in front of the stove. Her hands moved without thought, blankets, towels, hot water. She filled a basin and began to rub the puppy's fur gently with a warm cloth, melting away the ice inch by inch. The dog whimpered, a sound like a thread unraveling in the dark, and Ellie closed her eyes. She whispered nonsense. She called it Scout, the name slipping out like it had always belonged to him. Scout was small, no more than 10 weeks old, a mix of husky and maybe shepherd, with thick gray and white fur that had dulled from exposure. One ear was nicked. His paws were raw, but beneath the grime and tremble, there was a flicker of life. Ellie stayed with him, not daring to sleep. Her fingers shook from exhaustion and adrenaline. She wrapped him in a towel and set him in a box lined with wool. Every few minutes, she reached in and touched his flank, counting the rise and fall. And for the first time in weeks, she felt something other than static. As evening crept across the mountain, casting long blue shadows against the snowbanks outside, Ellie finally exhaled. Scout was breathing more steadily now. His nose had turned a pale pink. His limbs, though stiff, were no longer locked. She sat beside the box, back against the stove, her head resting against the cabinet behind her. She didn't notice the tears until they soaked the collar of her shirt. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft, silent, and unthreatening this time. It drifted against the window pane like feathers. Inside, the world was quiet, the kind of quiet that no longer frightened her. Scout stirred, just once, a tiny whimper that sounded almost like a question. And Ellie answered, not with words, but by staying right there beside him. The fire had long since burned down to a soft amber glow, casting trembling shadows on the pinewood walls. Scout lay curled tightly inside the wool-lined box, his breathing still uneven but far steadier than the shallow rasp it had been when Ellie first found him. She hadn't left his side except to stoke the fire and refill his water bowl with melted snow warmed gently over the stove. Outside, the wind began to moan again, the kind of low, eerie sound that seemed to come from the trees themselves. Ellie moved slowly now, every muscle stiff from a night without sleep. Her hoodie clung to her like damp wool, heavy from sweat and snow, and her eyes were rimmed red from staring too long at the unmoving rise and fall of Scout's ribs. Her stomach rumbled, ignored. Her thoughts were still wrapped in the image of him under the snow. How deliberate the burial had looked. Someone had wanted this puppy hidden, silenced. That thought sat in her chest like a stone. She was kneeling beside the box, tucking another heated towel around Scout's hind legs, when her hand brushed against something hard under his damp collar. Curious, Ellie sat up straighter and gently unfastened the clasp. A thin metal tag fell into her palm, charred around the edges, with soot embedded in its crevices. It looked like it had been exposed to fire, the string that held it frayed and blackened. She wiped it clean with a corner of her shirt, and then her heart slowed. Number 9, belonging to S.R.F. The letters were deeply etched, blocky, and cold to the touch. Ellie frowned, whispering the acronym aloud. S.R.F. The letters meant nothing to her. She'd lived in Snowridge for almost 4 years and had never heard of an S.R.F. Not as a company, not as a shelter. But something about the word belonging made her stomach twist. It wasn't a name tag. It was a claim. She stood and took the tag to the desk by the window, pulling an old county survey map from the drawer. Most of the marked locations were outdated. Hunting cabins that had been abandoned for decades, old ranger outposts, and railway spurs that hadn't seen activity in years. She circled the general region around the switch house where she had found Scout, but nothing labeled S.R.F. appeared. Ellie stared out the window, the wind carving streaks of frost along the glass. Her mind drifted back to Jason. He would have known. He had worked for county maintenance, part of a team that handled old infrastructure sites. His notebooks were still in the chest by the bed. The ones he filled with sketches and old names he'd collected like birdwatchers marked wings. But before she could cross the room, something slammed against her door. Once, then again. She froze. Another knock. Not like a branch blown loose, but sharp, deliberate. She moved slowly to the door, hand brushing against the axe handle propped nearby, out of habit more than intent. She opened the door only slightly, the chain still in place. Snow whirled inward like flour tossed by the wind. A man stood there, tall and broad-shouldered, his parka thick and dark green, zipped halfway to reveal a red flannel shirt. Snow clung to the folds of his hood, and his cheeks were raw from exposure. He looked about 40, though lines around his eyes suggested hard years. His jaw was square, lightly stubbled, and his eyes, an indistinct hazel, carried both exhaustion and a searching kind of alertness. "Ma'am," he said, lifting a gloved hand in a half-wave. "Sorry to drop in like this. My truck spun off near the trestle. Walked half a mile in that mess. Just need somewhere warm till it passes. I'm Wade Callahan." Ellie's instinct screamed to turn him away, but something in his voice, firm but not aggressive, carried honesty. She unlatched the chain and opened the door. "You're lucky you didn't freeze," she muttered, stepping aside. Wade stepped in, stamping the snow from his boots. He removed his gloves and hood, revealing thick, slightly disheveled brown hair flecked with snow. He had the look of someone used to hard work, strong arms, boots worn at the heel, and a scar that cut faintly through his right eyebrow. "Thank you," he said sincerely, rubbing his hands together near the fire. "I'll only stay an hour, if that's all right." Ellie nodded silently, not trusting herself to speak yet. He noticed Scout in the box immediately. His brow furrowed as he knelt beside it. "Where'd you find him?" "Near the old switch house. Buried," she said shortly. Wade didn't speak right away. Instead, he gently reached toward Scout, who stirred at the presence. He ran a thumb gently behind one ear and inspected the bruising, the frostbite along the tips. Then he said it. "This isn't a stray. He's one of theirs." "Whose?" Ellie asked. Wade sat back on his heels, face hardening. S.R.F. Snowridge Response Facility. Supposed to be shut down 5 years ago after a bunch of whistleblowers came forward. Animal mistreatment, forced aggression training, you name it. It was located near mile 34 in the ravine off Creek Road. Ellie's breath caught. "I've never heard of it. Wasn't meant for the public. They trained dog for disaster response, but pushed him too far. Turned into something darker. I used to do infrastructure work. I saw the kennels once. Regretted it since." Scout whined, trying to lift his head. Ellie moved instinctively to comfort him. Wade watched her, eyes softening. "You saved him," he said. "Not many would have stopped." "I didn't mean to get involved," she replied. "Doesn't matter. You are now." He stood and stretched, his shoulders cracking. "There's more to this. If someone's still using that place, it's a problem." Scout gave a soft bark, then curled deeper into the blanket. Wade turned back toward the window. Snow was falling again, thick and fast. "Storm's picking up. If you're okay with it, I'll stay till morning," Wade said. "Not just for shelter, but because if someone dumped that dog, they might come back." Ellie hesitated, then gave a small nod. That night, as the fire cracked and Scout slept deeper than before, Ellie took out one of Jason's old notebooks and flipped through the pages. There, near the back, was a sketch of a ravine, and in shaky pencil, a label. S.R.F, closed 18. Restricted. She stared at the page as the wind howled around the cabin. The next morning came reluctantly, smeared in gray and muffled by snowfall, so dense it made the world outside the cabin feel like a sealed envelope. Ellie stood by the wood stove, stirring a pot of oatmeal that neither she nor Wade had much appetite for. Scout was curled on a wool blanket nearby, his small frame still fragile, but noticeably warmer, his breathing steadier. His coat, though still patchy from frostburn, had begun to fluff slightly at the chest, and when Ellie approached, his tail gave a weak but deliberate thump. Wade sat at the table, shoulders hunched over a mug of black coffee, his eyes staring into the steam like it held a map. He'd barely spoken that morning, aside from a hoarse thank you and a grunted observation about the barometric pressure dropping. He looked tired, but not from the storm. It was the kind of tired that came from holding back too much for too long. You said you knew where S.R.F. was, Ellie said, her voice low. Wade nodded slowly. Not the main complex. That's gone. But there was a secondary site. Maintenance cellar near the trestle. Not many knew about it. It was mostly used as store gear, or dogs they didn't want seen. Her stomach turned. And you think Scout came from there? I think if we want answers, it's the place to start. Ellie agreed to go. Not because she wanted to know more. Truthfully, part of her feared what they'd find, but because she couldn't stomach the thought of another Scout lying beneath snow, never found. She wrapped Scout in a thick scarf and laid him gently in a makeshift sling bag that hung across her chest. He whimpered softly, but didn't resist. Wade led the way on foot, navigating the half-covered trail like someone who had walked it too many times. The snow reached mid-calf in places, and the sky above remained a flat slab of pewter, offering no guidance. They hiked for nearly 30 minutes before reaching a narrow gorge, where a rusted metal gate leaned precariously against a collapsed section of fence. Beyond it, set into the base of a ridge, was a small concrete structure half buried in snow and pine needles. The door had no handle, just a rusted ring and a keypad with faded numbers. Wade crouched and pulled back the underbrush along the sidewall. There's a service entrance through here, he muttered. Ellie followed him down the slope, where snow had formed a slushy chute. Wade grunted as he yanked open a hatch obscured by a broken panel of camouflage netting. The hinges screamed, but it gave way. Inside, the air was immediately wrong. Stale, metallic, with a trace of ammonia. The narrow staircase led down to what felt like a crawl space, but opened into a wide underground chamber lined with cinder blocks and rusted shelving. The temperature dropped sharply. Frost glittered on the ceiling like mold. Scout whimpered. Stay close, Wade murmured. They moved quietly past overturned bins, broken crates, and tangled wire. In the far corner, Ellie spotted something that stopped her breath, a line of metal cages. Most were empty, but clumps of fur clung to the bars. One had a shredded collar caught in the lock. Another had dried something, blood, on the concrete floor beneath it. How long has this been abandoned? She asked. 5 years. Maybe more. Then why does it smell like it's still being used? Wade didn't answer. He approached one of the cages, knelt, and picked up a length of chain still bolted to the wall. His hand trembled slightly. I used to fix these walls. The plumbing, too. There were 10 dogs here once. None of them ever made it into the field. Too aggressive. Or too scared. Ellie's eyes narrowed. You said you were maintenance. But you know a lot more than that. Wade turned slowly, his expression grim. They asked me to assist with evaluations. Behavioral observations. At first, it was just logging reactions, standard stuff. Then it got worse. Stress tests. Isolation. Forced exposure. One night, I walked in and found a dog that had chewed its own leg, trying to escape the tether. I filed a report. 2 days later, they fired me. Claimed I falsified it. The weight of his words pressed against the walls. Ellie leaned back, keeping one hand on Scout, whose ears had flattened tight against his skull. You didn't go public? I tried. No one cared. The state wanted it gone quietly, so they let it rot. Ellie didn't know what to believe. Wade's story rang with conviction, but so had other lies in her life. She remembered the counselor who told her after Jason's death that grief would fade with time, that if she just returned to routine, the rest would follow. It hadn't. Time didn't heal. It hardened. As she stood silently, Scout barked, short, sharp, and scared. He was staring at the far wall. Ellie turned her flashlight. Her breath caught. A tunnel. Narrow, recently disturbed. Snow had filtered in from a ceiling crack, revealing boot prints. Not old. Not washed out. Someone had been here. Wade stepped forward, inspecting the marks. 3 days, maybe 4. Big tread. Military style. They knew this place. Ellie felt heat rise to her throat. Then someone is still using it. They didn't go farther. Not without knowing who, or what, waited beyond. Back at the cabin, the fire welcomed them like an old friend. Ellie placed Scout near the hearth, unwrapped him, and let him sleep. Her thoughts spiraled as she sipped tea she couldn't taste. Wade remained by the window, watching the woods. "I'm not asking for your trust," he said quietly. "But I'm not the villain in this." Ellie didn't reply. But later, alone in her bedroom, she opened Jason's second notebook. On the final page was a name she hadn't noticed before. R. Morley, Field Supervisor, S.R.F. Secondary Cellar. And a note scrawled beneath. "Do not trust what's buried, especially if it breathes." Scout stirred restlessly in his sleep, twitching at every sudden creak from the walls or gust against the cabin windows. He had been healing faster than expected. His appetite had returned, the color was coming back to his nose, and the patches in his coat were beginning to blend into a soft gray-white halo. But something had shifted in his behavior. Every time the distant sound of a train whistle echoed from the gorge, he would flinch, ears flat, eyes wide, sometimes darting beneath the kitchen bench where he pressed his body to the floorboards and growled low, like the sound itself brought pain. Ellie sat near the hearth, a sketchbook resting on her lap. She hadn't drawn in over a year, not since Jason's funeral, but tonight her hand moved again, slowly outlining Scout's curled figure with tentative strokes of charcoal. The image formed beneath her fingers, a creature both wounded and noble, small but stubbornly alive. She looked up at the sound of his whimper. He was staring toward the window now, body tense. Wade emerged from the storage room, carrying an armload of firewood, sweat darkening the collar of his thermal shirt. He paused when he saw Scout's posture. "He's reacting again?" he asked, voice low. Ellie nodded. "Same sound. Same time every evening. It's like he knows when the freight line passes, even though it's half a mile away." Wade crouched beside Scout, letting the dog sniff his hand before gently placing a palm on his back. They used auditory commands in the S.R.F. program. Whistles, horns, even industrial sounds. Conditioning through trauma. The more painful the memory, the faster the response. "Why would they do that?" Ellie asked, her voice sharper than she meant. "To create predictability." "Obedience," Wade replied grimly. "They didn't want loyalty, just reaction." Outside, snow had turned to ice, clicking softly against the windows. Ellie pulled her cardigan tighter, suddenly cold despite the fire. The wind shifted direction around midnight, slamming hard against the eastern side of the cabin. Ellie had just started to doze in the armchair, Scout curled beneath her legs, when she heard it. Click. Subtle. Too precise for the wind. Her body tensed. Then came the sound of a latch, just outside the back door. She was on her feet in seconds, gently nudging Scout back behind the wood stove. Wade appeared from the hallway, barefoot but alert, his eyes meeting hers. "Someone's here," she whispered. Wade crossed the room silently, grabbing the fireplace poker. Ellie reached for the rifle Jason had kept behind the entry cabinet. She had never used it, but her hands remembered the weight. The cabin's back door burst open with a violent crash. A shadowed figure surged into the room, cloaked in heavy winter gear, face obscured by a ski mask. His eyes locked on Scout immediately. Without a word, he lunged toward the dog. Wade moved first, intercepting him with a shoulder slam that sent both men crashing into the kitchen table. Dishes flew. The fire flared with the wind rushing in. Ellie tried to aim, but her hands shook too hard. Wade roared, pushing the intruder back toward the hallway. The attacker struck him with a flashlight, hard. Wade dropped to one knee, blood blooming from his temple. "Leave him," Ellie shouted, voice rising from somewhere deeper than panic, something closer to fury. The attacker hesitated. Scout, in the meantime, had retreated into a corner, snarling louder than his size should have allowed. The man lunged again, but Ellie fired, not to kill, but at the ceiling. The blast rang through the cabin like a thunderclap. The intruder froze. Wade seized the moment, slamming the man's head against the doorframe. He crumpled. Breathing heavily, Wade dragged the body onto the porch, tied his wrists with paracord, and shut the door. The hail had thickened now, sharp as gravel, bouncing off the windows and roof like nature itself had joined the chaos. Inside, Scout was trembling, tucked between the stove and Ellie's boots. She dropped to her knees and scooped him into her arms. "You're safe," she whispered. You're safe. Wade leaned against the doorframe, wiping blood from his temple. We need to call someone, he muttered, but no one local. Not if they're involved. Ellie helped him sit. Her hands were still shaking, but the rifle lay beside her now, familiar and steady. You said you didn't want my trust, she said, wrapping gauze around Wade's wound. But I need to give it, or this never ends. Wade didn't reply. He only nodded, quietly accepting what she had just given him. Later, after Scout finally fell asleep in Ellie's lap and Wade rested against the couch with ice pressed to his head, she picked up Jason's notebook again. This time, she noticed a tucked piece of paper, a torn photograph of 5 dogs lined up in front of a cage enclosure. Each one had a number on its collar, and one of them, Scout, unmistakably younger, bore a tag that read 9. Next to him was a larger, darker dog with tag 10. Beneath the photo, Jason had written only 2 words. Still missing. The snow had thinned by morning, turning to a brittle crust that crunched underfoot as Ellie and Wade made their way up the narrowing trail toward Whitetail Gorge. Scout padded behind them, his paws wrapped with strips of gauze Wade had reinforced with soft booties fashioned from flannel and duct tape. The pup moved cautiously, nose low to the ground, tail swaying nervously. He was more alert than usual, as if some old instinct was drawing him forward. Tucked inside Ellie's jacket pocket was the scrap of paper she had found inside Scout's collar the night before, a fragment of old topographical parchment, torn at the corners, with 3 landmarks roughly etched in pencil. A circle had been drawn around one, labeled simply, Silo Number 3, Intake. It had taken him the better part of the night to match the rough symbols with real places. Finally, Wade remembered an old ranch property, long abandoned, located on a plateau just above the eastern lip of Whitetail Gorge. It had once been owned by the Weatherly family, ranchers who sold the land back to the state 2 decades ago after their cattle froze during a failed winter drive. Since then, rumors had lingered. Military trucks, quiet helicopters, dogs barking through the night. The sky hung low as they approached the edge of the gorge, their breath crystallizing in the cold. The farm came into view slowly. First the rusted arch of a wind vane poking from a collapsed barn roof, then the faint outline of a water tower, and finally, a row of blackened wooden posts where fencing had once stood. They passed through the broken gate in silence. The yard beyond was scattered with remnants, a scorched plastic bowl, the handle of a cracked shovel, and a thin length of chain embedded in frozen mud. Scout sniffed at the chain and whined softly. Then Ellie saw them, rows of skeletal cages lined up in a sunken trench behind what remained of the main house. Most were empty, warped by heat and time, but some still held fragments of rope or burned nylon collars. A clipboard, half-scorched, lay frozen to the earth. Ellie pried it up gently. The top page had a faint table. Names were never used, just numbers. Número 7, Número 8, Número 9. Wade crouched nearby, brushing aside debris until his hand landed on a sealed plastic envelope buried beneath soot and hay. Inside were forms, typed, official-looking, stamped with the logo of the Snowridge Emergency Response Division. At the bottom of each page, approved by M. Harrow, Municipal Director. Ellie stared at the name, pulse quickening. Harrow, Mayor Malcolm Monroe. Wade stood, eyes narrowing. He used to run the County Emergency Response Council, oversaw disaster drills and fire evacuations. I remember hearing rumors he started a canine response unit. Off the books. They said it was shut down when funding disappeared. But I always thought that was too neat an ending. Ellie's voice came out hollow. Jason used to work for the town. His notes, his warnings, they all make sense now. Suddenly, the pieces clicked. The man her husband had quietly investigated. The strange way Jason had grown withdrawn in his final months. And the fact that every page in his field log ended with initials, MH. Scout barked suddenly, once sharply, then ran toward the barn ruins. Ellie followed. Behind the half-collapsed wall, hidden beneath a sheet of canvas, was a steel hatch. Its hinges were scorched, but the locking mechanism looked newer than the surrounding decay. Wade examined it. "This isn't old farm security," he muttered. This is military grade. He knelt, fiddled with a corroded panel, and after a few tries, the lock released with a sharp hiss. The hatch creaked open, revealing a narrow tunnel that led downward. No ladder, just a ramp with grooved steel sides for traction. "I'll go first," Wade said. Ellie nodded, grabbing a flashlight from her pack. They descended into a dim, silent corridor. The air inside was heavy with mildew and metal. The walls had once been painted white, but now showed water damage and handprints, smudged, frantic, small. At the bottom, they found the remnants of an office. Overturned file cabinets, scorched folders, and an old radio base fused by heat. A metal door in the back had been forced open, revealing a storage room filled with melted crates and broken glass vials. One corner of the room held a single kennel. Empty, but not untouched. The floor was smeared with ash, and a patch of blood was still dark against the concrete. Scout stood at the threshold, silent now, his head low. "I think this was where they broke them," Wade said, his voice strained. "Where they decided who was useful and who got dumped." Ellie stared at the far wall where a whiteboard still clung, crookedly. Faint letters remained. Number 10, retained. Not compliant. Her voice cracked. There was another one. Another dog from Jason's photo. Suddenly, movement above them. A sharp sound like gravel, shifting. Wade turned off the flashlight. They listened. A voice, low and male, muttered something they couldn't make out. "Someone's here," Ellie whispered. Wade drew a small hunting knife from his coat. Out the back, they scrambled up a rusted maintenance stairwell and emerged behind the farmhouse, breathless and ducked low. A black SUV was parked beyond the trees, engine still running. A man leaned against the driver's door, smoking, face mostly hidden beneath a beanie and dark beard. Scout froze, then growled. Ellie's eyes widened. "That's him," she hissed. "The man who tried to take Scout. He's back." Wade pulled her back. "We can't confront him now. We need proof, not another close call." They watched as the man lifted a large crate from the barn and loaded it into the vehicle. Then he got in and drove off into the trees. Ellie stared after the SUV until it disappeared. "This isn't over," she said. "No, what did he play? But we're close." The fog rolled in over Snowridge like a slow exhale, softening the jagged edges of the world. It curled around the pines, drifted across the old rail tracks, and settled gently over the grounds of what had once been the signal tower outpost. The building had changed. What was once a derelict utility station now bore the clean lines of fresh siding, a newly painted sign, and the warm scent of cedar and straw wafting from its windows. Above the door hung a carved wooden plaque that read, "Hollow Light Rescue, a haven for the forgotten." Ellie stood near the front gate, scarf wrapped snugly around her neck, clipboard in hand. The wind tugged at her coat, and her breath fogged the glass of her thermos as she sipped from it. Her eyes watched the horizon, the same view she used to dread, the same road that once felt like a lifeline and a prison both. But now it was something else entirely. It was a beginning. Scout sat by her feet, tail curled over his paws, his ears flicking at every sound from the mist. His coat had fully come in, thick and plush, gray-white with a dark saddle down his back and a small crescent of black on his forehead. His posture was proud now, no longer guarded. The scars beneath his fur were still there, but he no longer flinched at footsteps. He no longer hid from whistles. He had reclaimed his voice. Inside the facility, crates had been replaced with kennels lined with blankets, and the floors were dotted with chew toys and old rugs. The small team working with Ellie now included Marcy Holloway, a middle-aged former vet tech who had retired early after witnessing abuse at another clinic. Marcy was short and compact, with kind eyes and cropped silver hair, always wearing vests with too many pockets and thick rubber gloves. She rarely spoke unless necessary, but the animals responded to her in a way that required no translation. She had seen enough cruelty to stop explaining kindness. And there was Clara Jennings, the journalist who had arrived 2 weeks after the video Ellie posted went viral. Clara was 38, tall and thin, with long curls the color of rusted copper and a voice that carried like a radio host's, clear, passionate, persuasive. She had grown up in a foster home, without pets, and had spent her adult life chasing down every lead on unlicensed breeders and unethical rescue centers. When she first arrived in Snowridge, her boots still muddy from a field investigation in Nebraska, she handed Ellie a flash drive and said, "I believe your truth. Let's make sure everyone else does, too." Together, they had turned a storm of outrage into structured exposure. The footage from the burned farm, the sealed files, and the radio logs Ellie and Wade had recovered were edited into a sharp, unflinching narrative. Clara had layered in voiceover, including Scout's rescue story and the discovery of the intake list. Within 48 hours of publishing, the video had reached over 400,000 views. Comments poured in. Then came emails from local reporters, and finally, a phone call from the state's Bureau of Animal Welfare. 3 days later, the raid happened. The warehouse on Red Wind Road, an unmarked structure south of the county line, was stormed by authorities. They found 7 dogs in poor condition, along with records leading back to Harrow, the former mayor, and 2 other officials. Arrests followed. Investigations spread across county lines. Ellie hadn't expected the storm to end so quickly, but the truth had spread faster than secrecy could hold. Today marked a new chapter. From the edge of the fog came the low growl of a diesel engine. Ellie turned. A large transport truck rounded the bend, headlights cutting through the mist. Scout rose to his feet, posture straight, eyes locked. He barked once, and then again. The truck rumbled to a stop at the gate. Marcy emerged from the kennel building, gloves still damp, and opened the latch. Wade stepped out of the driver's side of the truck. He wore a black utility jacket over flannel, his dark hair pulled back beneath a wool cap. His bruises from the cabin night had long since healed, but the lines of weariness had stayed. They no longer made him look broken, just seasoned, grounded. "You ready?" he asked, stepping down. Ellie nodded. Wade moved to the back of the truck and opened the latch. Inside were 5 kennels, each with a different shape curl within. A large chocolate lab, missing 1 ear. A German shepherd with a shaved flank from surgery. A mutt with patchy fur and huge, frightened eyes. And in the far corner, a quiet black dog with 1 gray paw, staring silently at Scout. Scout barked again, tail wagging hard. It was number 10, the same dog from Jason's photo, now 3 years older, with scars of his own, but the same strong frame and eyes like dark amber. Wade looked between them. "Name's Hunter," he said. "We found him at the warehouse." Scout padded forward as Marcy opened the gate. And in a moment Ellie would remember for the rest of her life, Scout let out a bark, not of fear, but welcome. Hunter lowered his head, sniffed once, then pressed his muzzle to Scout's neck. They stood like that for a while, 2 numbers no longer marked, only known. Later that evening, as the dogs explored the fenced yard and volunteers unpacked supplies, Ellie sat beneath the old signal pole, Scout by her side. She held Jason's notebook open on her knees, now worn from use and snow. She traced her fingers over his last written words. "Do not trust what's buried, especially if it breathes." She smiled, eyes damp, because sometimes what breathes beneath the snow is not just pain. Sometimes it's hope, waiting to be found. Sometimes what the world throws away still carries the power to heal. Scout wasn't just a rescued dog. He was a reminder that even when we feel forgotten, broken, or buried beneath life's coldest storms, there is still a chance to be seen, to be loved, and to be brought home. In our daily lives, we pass by so many stories without noticing. But maybe today is the day we choose to look closer. Maybe someone or something out there is waiting for a second chance, just like Scout. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below with your thoughts, or just write amen if you're praying for every forgotten soul to find their way home. Don't forget to subscribe for more true inspired stories of love, courage, and second chances. May God bless you and guide every heart that's still searching for light.